is Leslie Salgado. Thank you so much for coming. I see quite a few new faces and some very, very old friends. I don't mean the age. We've been here for quite a while. In fact, our group will be 30 years next year.
Wow.
So, and I see some faces here that I have seen for about the last 30 years. Yeah, so it's exciting. A lot of good things have happened. I think we have made a difference in some things. Today is one of those events. The object of our group and what we do with it, we are a very small grassroots organization, as you know, is to basically present an alternative point of view on Latin American issues. We're also connected with other peace and justice issues because Latin America is no different than other regions of the world. And unfortunately, US policies in many of those regions are not the most desirable, to say the least. So today the program is on Cuba. I will go into that in a couple of minutes. I'm going to make a couple of announcements about upcoming programs in our community. One, we have a program next weekend, Sunday, October the 4th. It's right here in the same place. It's organized by the Committee for Palestinian Rights. It's also an event that's free and open to the public. It's from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. Dori Rausch is back here if you need some more information. The speaker is Daoud Nassar. The title of the program is Steadfast Witness, Planting Seeds of Peace in Palestine. So you're welcome to join us to that. The Jocofola, Howard County Friends of Latin America, has a program entitled Domestic Violence, Immigrant Women and Children. What can we do to protect the most vulnerable? Vulnerable. This is a discussion on immigrants' rights that's going to be on Saturday, October the 24th. From 3 to 3:30 we'll have refreshments. From 3:30 to 5 o'clock we will have a program. Our guest speaker is a lawyer who lives on the Eastern Shore. His name is Kevin Rosenthal. He has traveled extensively in Central and South America, and he will be talking about that issue. Then, if you're not in our mailing list, there's this form in the back that you're welcome to take. In the back, there is a sign-up area where you can add your name and leave it there for us. I will be very happy to add your name to our mailing list. Okay? And I think there's another friend here who has some other announcements. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Omar Igosa. And a couple of us here from Washington for this meeting. We're part of a group called the National Network on Cuba. Some of you may have heard about it. We're the DC Metro Coalition for Cuba. We're going to have the NNOC, National Network on Cuba, will have its annual meeting on November 7 and 8. And on the evening of November 7, which is a Saturday, we'll be having Kenya Serrano speak at the University of District of Columbia Law School. Kenya is the president of the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples, otherwise abbreviated ICAP, ECAP, which is their outreach organization around the world. They just had a big meeting in Hanoi, actually. So this will be a rare opportunity. She could have never got in before the changes of relations between Cuba and the United States. She would have never gotten a visa, or actually hasn't gotten a visa. She's applied every year. But we think she's going to get a visa this time, and we invite all of you to come. If you're interested, come out. He's right there with the blue sweatshirt on. And Aaron is here with the green dress on. And you can give us a way to contact you to keep you abreast of what's happening. On October 8th, we're going to have a planning meeting where all of you are invited to come and help plan this event with Kenya Serrano on November 7th. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's get started with the program. I have to give my special thanks to Luis Rumbao, he accepted to come and fill the place of Mavis Anderson. Mavis, many of you have known, she works for the Latin American Working Group. She was originally our guest speaker, but she had an invitation this weekend in New York City to meet with President Castro and other folks from the Cuban delegation and other United Nations folks. And she said, Leslie, how can I pass that? And I said, well. So Luis had also had an invitation, I understand, but he was kind enough to take us up on these. Luis is a lawyer. He was originally born in Cuba and has lived here in the United States since he was 10 years old. He is the communications director for the Cuban American Alliance. It's a national organization in California that advocates lifting of the U.S. embargo and the establishment of normal relations between the U.S. and Cuba. He has family in Havana and Cienfuegos and has visited the island several times for the last 35 years. He was the president of the Latin American Folk Institute, an organization for DC and Maryland that focused on the traditional music and culture of Latin America and the Caribbean and on their influence on modern genres such as jazz. And that's how I met him probably about 30 years ago. So thank you, Luis. The plan is to have Luis speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers for about 20, 30 minutes. And he will stay here for a few minutes after that in case people want to talk to him personally. Okay? Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Leslie. I've known Leslie a long time, and she, my main thing I would say about it, she has not slowed down.
Please.
What I would say about Leslie is she has not slowed down in those 30 years that I've known her. She's been a constant. Well, I understood we were going to talk about, or Mavis was going to talk about, the immediate future in Cuba, and are things really going to change? Have we reached a qualitative point of
Can
change?
you hear back there? Or
Yes.
do you need it to be louder? You're okay? Speak up.
So I kept thinking of what the kids say on a long trip in the station wagon. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And I wanted to tell you that, no, I don't think we are there. We may not be there for still several years, if at all. To understand that, I wanted to go back. It's always good to look at history. I wanted to go back to history and take a look at why the U.S. as a country, over decades, over centuries, has maintained this obsession with Cuba. With taking possession of it, which it did at some point, and then had to give up, and continues to try to, the country continues to try to go back to that time when Cuba was totally, basically, an annex of the U.S. And the second most important person after the president of Cuba was the ambassador at the U.S. Embassy. And I would like to go back to 1762 for an event that most people in the U.S., really around the world, don't think too much about. In 1762, while Spain was still the most powerful empire in the Americas, and it had taken parts of North America, Louisiana, and all of, well, it was called New Mexico, but it was all from Texas out to California. All that was Spain claimed. Spain, it was Indian territory, really, Mexican territory. In the midst of all that, the British managed to take Havana for 2 years. It was not defended as it is now. In fact, after that happened, And after the Spaniards took back Havana, the Spanish king spent a heck of a lot of money to build the defenses that are now so iconic. The pictures of Havana, the Morro Castle on one side and the La Punta fortress on the other. It was a narrow inlet, cannons pointed to any ship crazy enough to go in there, as well as shooting out into the ocean. But at that time, in 1762, those were not there. So the British took it over and later traded it back to Spain in exchange for Florida. That's quite a deal. One city for the territory of Florida. Why was that so important for the British? Well, they had, the colonies went down to Georgia. You could plug in Georgia, plug in Florida, you had the entire East Coast. And Spain was still a very powerful empire. So the British colonists were, British colonists, well, it was British. Then later, when they were son of the British, the US colonists, they were very much aware of Cuba and of Havana. He was not the king of sugar at the time. It didn't have gold like Mexico or Peru, but it was marvelously located right at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico. And it was a major point of trade, point of departure and receipt of trade, and of a place to fix ships. Everything from Spain, that from New Spain, that was shipping off to European Spain, came mostly from Havana. And the conditions were there for that. The British wanted to just replace that. When the British were overthrown by the US colonists, the folks who ran the colonies, of course, inherited that knowledge from their prior government. They had been part of that government for a while, and they knew perfectly well what was there. So that soon after the triumph of the U.S. Revolution, or the American Revolution, the more forward-thinking leaders of the country started projecting their plans of expansion. I place Thomas Jefferson as the principal one. He was truly a visionary. He sent out Lewis and Clark, remember, to figure out where the Indians were, what was out there, because he was already thinking of going to the Pacific. He also had, and expressed so very clearly in writing, he had a great interest in taking Mexico and Cuba. He said if we could just take these two countries, or these two territories, Mexico and Cuba, that would complete the happiness of our unions. It works, something like that. I'm not quoting directly, but pretty close to that. He knew that this would not be easy at that time in the early 1800s, because Spain was still the bully in the block. It would make no sense. So he decided, or he proposed, it was his view that the U.S. had to wait until the time was right. And his ideas were shared with John Quincy Adams, came after him as the foreign minister for President Monroe. And so Quincy Adams, who came up with the idea of the ripe apple, the Newton's apple, I would fall. Just as Newton's apple had fallen by gravity to the lap of Newton, then Cuba, when she became ripe, would be drawn by political gravity inevitably into the lap of the United States. And he was the one, John Quincy Adams, who wrote the principles that were announced by the President Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine. 1808, Mexico had called for independence. It would take a little time for that process to be complete. But it was clear when Mexico announced it was ready to split from Spain, you could hear the oh-ohs in Washington. What are we going to do now? Indeed, by 1820, 1820s, around 18, not long after, most of all of the Central and South American governments, countries had declared their independence. So the idea was, we have to keep this whole thing all together under Spain. And then when we overthrow Spain, we can take the whole thing all together. And that would be one heck of an empire that we will have, the US empire. The fear was that if they left Spain, the other countries would ally with Britain or France or Holland or Germany or whoever happened, Portugal, whoever happened to be around at the time. And that is what was needed to be prohibited, made impossible. So that was the Monroe Doctrine, which announced, Europe, you stay out of here. You can have Africa, you can have Asia, but we will take the Americas. It will be the Americas for the Americans, that is, for the North Americans, but not for the South Americans and Central Americans. They were going to just be absorbed into that. Jefferson's view held. Jefferson's plan was taken over by successive generations. They would wait until the time was right. The first of those two countries that Jefferson wanted was Mexico, of course, already freed from Spain and now kind of not entirely Spanish, not entirely Indian, mixture of a big country, and it had a lot of wealth. And there was talk about taking all of it, so in around 1848, I think it was, something like that, the U.S. declared a war against Mexico on phony grounds. It's really ridiculous. And of course, the U.S. beat the heck out of Mexico, and also Santa Anna, the president and the leader and the general in charge of defending Mexico in that war, was simultaneously making backdoor contact with the White House to talk about for how much money he could get, how much money they would give him to throw the fight. He was willing to give up Mexico as long as he got some money out of it. Well, so necessarily then the U.S. won and they took half of Mexico. The original plan was taking all of Mexico. But cooler minds said, not so fast. There's not too many people up in the north because it's a desert and we haven't invented air conditioning yet. We don't even have electricity. So why do you want that? You think it's easy? Yeah, a few Indian peoples are up there. But if you get to the south, around Tenochtitlan, the capital of Mexico, Mexico City and Veracruz and all that, that's full of Indians. You don't want to take a country like that because you'll never be able to dominate them. So he said, okay, we'll take half of Mexico only. And the next in line was Cuba. That came up in 1898. Cubans had been at war on and off for about 30 years with Spain. Spain was about to fall. It was as predictable that Spain was going to fall as more recently in 1974 or whatever it was predictable that Portugal would lose all of its colonies in Africa. It would lose Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau and Angola. All of that was claimed by Portugal. But it was clear this is going down. Spain was overextended. The Armada had been beaten already. And so the chance came up when the Maine blew up. The U.S. immediately said that the Spaniards had done it and therefore declare war against Spain. And in no time at all, the U.S. had inserted itself into what had been a war of independence on the part of the Cubans, and called it then the Spanish-American War, leaving the Cuban thing out of the equation. They made a treaty in Paris from which the Cubans were excluded. And as it turned out then, Spain ceded its claim to a number of possessions, and the U.S. was free to take them, well, not free, for $20 million to take all the other ones. And they were Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Of those, Puerto Rico is still a colony of the U.S., so is Guam. The Philippines were an official colony after beginning in 1904, around there, until 1954, after World War II, when the U.S. finally gave it up. And Cuba was scheduled to be one of those colonies. But the Philippines were themselves fighting a war of independence, and the U.S. had to take care of that first. The Philippines was very important. Zillion people, lots of natural resources, and the doorway to Asia. That was very important, and the Filipinos were fighting back. They were determined fighters. The U.S., which had claimed to liberate Philippines, had liberated them from Spain, but not from the U.S. And at that time, the new weapon was the Gatling machine gun. You've seen those in the movies. The Philippines did not have those. So the war consisted basically of U.S. soldiers mowing down bunches of Filipinos. It was a tremendous massacre. But the U.S. had to finish that war. So it decided, as to Cuba, we'll give them independence, but we'll give them limited independence. The Senator Platt from Connecticut insisted that there be an amendment to the new Constitution, which provided that basically the U.S. would still run the show. They would have, the Cubans would seem to be running, kind of like D.C. The Cubans could run it, but the Congress could call them off anytime and change whatever the action was. And then that same year, by the way, the U.S. also took Hawaii. So there was a real sweep of properties. Hawaii would soon become territory and in short order a state. That was the expansion, full expansion, not just to the Pacific coast, but across the Pacific and aiming into Asia. All assisted by what is the phrase, that manifest destiny. It was, what else could we do except take over the Pacific? We are destined to be that. That was the same view as to Cuba. That's the same kind of view of John Quincy of the ripe apple, which will inevitably become part of the U.S. That's just the way it was, because they're exceptional. So there was a pseudo-independence in Cuba. There was no independence in Puerto Rico or in Guam, and there was no independence in Philippines. As part of being given this pseudo-independence, the Cubans had to accept certain conditions. One of them was the lease of Guantanamo base. That's where this comes from. This is why Guantanamo is still in the hands of the U.S. It had wanted 2 or 3 more harbors, bays, and it had wanted also the entire Isle of Pines, or Isle of Youth, it's called today, which is one pretty big island. It's its own special province in Cuba. But in the end, the Cubans made enough noise to say, we are beaten and destroyed, but we're willing to kill a few more of you if you refuse. So it was settled that they would take, the U.S. would take Guantanamo and give up all of these other things. After all, they would have pretty good control. They would have Puerto Rico bases, they'll control the Caribbean, and Guantanamo would be perfect looking back, looking down to the Panama Canal. that was about to be built. And it would be just a dandy base to manage all the Caribbean and keep an eye and be ready to intervene in the Panama Canal. So the U.S. was happy with that deal pretty much. The U.S. companies invested bunches of money. You have to remember too, back in those days, at the time of Cuban independence, there was something like 1 million people on the island. And a whole lot of them were Africans who have been recently, relatively recently, given freedom because Cuba and Brazil were the last two countries to prohibit slavery. And there were restrictions, as in the U.S., in the voting. You needed to have a certain social standing, not just anybody could vote. Well, anyway, the entire island was very sparsely occupied, and businesses from the U.S. thinking, well, we could really make a lot of money here. They ended up having the monopoly of electricity and telephone and telegraph, trains, and so on. By 1933, things were about to change. There had been in the late 20s, the roaring 20s, there had been an elected president, Gerardo Machado. He finished his term, and then he didn't want to go. So he arranged things and got his own party and the opposition party to say it was okay for him to be in office for another term. But he was basically a dictator, and he was a hated dictator. So there was a general uprising, like as it happened later with the in the 1950s. There was a general uprising of the whole people. The two last best friends of Gerardo Machado before he ran out of the country were the Army and the United States, because they were really close. In fact, Machado had stock in the General Electric related companies. It was that kind of deal. When Machado left in 1934, the person left that became the strong man of Cuba was the new General of the Army, General Fulgencio Batista. He had been a low-ranking officer, sergeant specialist in taking shorthand. And he led a coup by the lower army officers, and he became the general, and he took the power, and eventually became a president. Then he would give up the presidency and name somebody else. He was in and out until 1952, when he got tired of playing the appearance of elections and democracy and just declared his dictatorship. If you look at the front page of the New York Times at the time, or some other newspapers, you'd be surprised. Because what did the U.S. do? Did they demand elections? Did they say, we're concerned about this, we don't want any more dictators? No, the United States said, this is wonderful. We're celebrating because Fulgencio is our good friend. We've known him forever. And he's always been our guy. He has, this is almost a quotation also, the firm hand that is needed to control those, those uppity Cubans that like to get into uprisings once in a while. So he had the full support of the U.S., and that's when it started. The corporations went back in. Then the mafia went in. The mafia Meyer Lansky from Los Angeles, from Las Vegas, and the mafia of Santo Traficante from Tampa in Florida. The two of them were ready to set up an empire of the mafia, which was okay with the FBI, because that way they would offload some of the problems down to Cuba. Batista was soon working with the mafia. He got half the cut of everything of the hotel casinos every night. He was headed up at night, and he was giving us his satchel of money right there every night. The U.S. knew all this. This is a horrendously corrupt marriage between a bloody dictator and the mafia, who were really good at putting up casino hotels all around Havana and some other important cities like Santiago and Cienfuegos. And the plan was to turn the entire island of Cuba into one big Las Vegas. That dictatorship is what provoked the socialist revolution that came to power in 1959. And the story would have been far different if the dictatorship of Batista had been something far different. But ever since, the U.S. has manifested this urge to take back control of Cuba. They were U.S. officials. I think the people of the U.S. really don't know what's going on except what they read there. Say up in the before internet times. It was really easy to make people believe this set of truth that you're being handed down in the newspaper. But the officials and the corporations and the bankers and all the people who wanted to get back into the control of Cuba started manifesting the urge to take it back. So there was a series of things, the invasion of Bay of Pigs, the beginning of the embargo at the beginning, which later became the blockade, the Operation Mongoose, harassment and shooting them up at the border, secret agents, all that kind of stuff. That was messed up. That was stopped in its tracks by the alliance with the Soviet Union. Because with that, they weren't dealing with a little island anymore. They were dealing with big, powerful enemy. So thanks to that relationship, Cuba managed to survive for another 30 years on its own before the Soviet Union collapsed. By that time, the revolution was very much established within the country. One reason that the U.S., I think, especially has wanted to go back to the old times is that Cuba has set a terrifically bad example for Latin American countries and for underdeveloped countries around the world. It is mind-boggling to think that this island, which began with 1 million people at the time, it was 6 million people at the time of the socialist revolution. Now it's 11.2. But an island may be mid-sized, but in terms of population, a small island just north of the U.S. and always with a history of penetration and control by the U.S. was able to stick it out one way or another, with the Soviets and without the Soviets, with a blockade, without a blockade. Somehow they muddled through. So by this century, they were they're still trying. The last set of people who go back a second. The government of George Bush, was terrifically aggressive. This is the time of the war against Afghanistan, the war against Iraq, taking over the Middle East, and the warnings, any of you who misbehave are going to get the same thing we gave to Iraq. Any questions? Within that kind of atmosphere, and that's when the blockade became really, really strict. Because by then there had been 2 sets of legislation to tighten the blockade. There was no more legislation to change, and so they started changing the rules, the administrative rules, to squeeze the last penny out of Cuba. That was replaced then by Obama and Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. And Hillary was into her soft power thing. She really liked all these secret agents that go in there and people who would turn other people inside to a different view, and a little distributing a little money and promising all that kind of stuff. It did not work very well because those schemes were always detected, if not by Cuban state intelligence, then by people who had been approached by the CIA or the embassy or USAID or any of these agencies who go down there, and then they would go to state security and say, I'm being recruited, what do I do? And they would say, well, let's do this, play along, and we'll catch him in the act. And then they would. That happened a lot, but not to the knowledge of people in the US. Cubans had a website with all kinds of information and the videos and the proof and all that. Never see that here. But it was happening all the time. And Hillary and the USAD, the contractors for USAID, especially called DAI, in Bethesda, Maryland, who's made millions of dollars just on tricky stuff for Cuba alone. They kept trying, but then this stuff kept blowing up. And the last two big blow-ups were the one of something called Sunsuneo, which was an attempt to recruit young people. That ended up being questioned by Congress at an official hearing. And USAID had no good, I don't know if you followed that one, had no good answers. The thing was a mess. And also, especially the big one was Alan Gross. When Alan Gross became a prisoner in Cuba, then things changed for the United States. The United States had the Cuban 5 here, and they had control of everything on this side. They had control of their agents over there, and usually when it was like somebody from the embassy, they had diplomatic protection. So the Cubans didn't try to put them in jail, they just sent them back. And also they were smart enough not to put U.S. officers in jail, knowing that they might get a drone coming in the window anytime if they did that. But Alan Gross was not an officer of the U.S. He was a contracted actor for DAI, which in turn had a contract with USAID, which in turn got money from the U.S. State Department, which is what they had wanted to do. They had wanted to set up this picture of distance between the last actor and where it originally came from. And Alan Gross is out there by his own, and he got caught on his own. He went to jail on his own. And that is one of the things that pushed at least some elements of the government to think, maybe we have to do this differently. This is just not working out. And eventually, Alan Gross was traded. He and another guy, another U.S. agent, were traded for the remaining Cuban 5, or remaining four of the Cuban 5. And at the same time, that's when it became possible, after all of the discussions around that, it became possible for the government of Cuba and part of the government of the U.S. to say, let's just try to fix up things and stop this silliness of trying to pretend after 54 years that we're winning, because we're not. We may not be losing, but we're not winning. They were losing in international diplomacy, in international politics, which again did not filter very much into U.S. media. But at the UN, you probably know, the U.S., every October it gets pasted. Ever since 1972, the Torricelli Law, 92, the Torricelli Law, more and more countries just voted against it. So by last year, there were only 2 countries in favor of the blockade, the U.S. and Israel. Everybody else abstained, voted against. The total vote, I think, was like 188 against, for the blockade, 2. This year is going to be absurd because the government of the United States is now against the blockade. Israel is upset because they were left out of that whole series of discussions. Israel did not know any more than the other people inside the U.S. government that all of a sudden the president would flip things. So they're really, and they're having a tiff with Obama for other reasons. I've been thinking, well, I think Israel this time is going to abstain, leaving the U.S. alone. But now there's a report, maybe it was one of those trial balloons. There was a report in the media that the U.S. may abstain. And if that happens, then it would be 0 nations in the world in support of the blockade. And that would be astounding. And the U.S. would look just incredibly stupid. Also, that would provoke a war with hardliners in Congress. Meanwhile, also, Latin America and Caribbean have become an entirely different thing than when it was controlled as a bunch of little annexes of the U.S. Now they're very independent. All of the countries of Latin America, all of the countries of America, except for the U.S. and Canada, joined into a group called CELAC, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is something like the OAS, but without North Americans. And every one of those countries, even the right-wing countries, even the neoliberals in alliance with the U.S., like Mexico, Costa Rica, Peru, Chile, Colombia, all of them said Cuba has to be part of the Summit of the Americas. But we're not going to have any more summits of the Americas. And we're not going to be talking to the North in the same way. And for the one last year, Obama would have been trounced. He would have been just kicked out the door by Latin Americans and Caribbeans. Except that he came with the news that there was a change. And then he was treated very well, and people really liked him because he did that. Had he not, he would have been another diplomatic and political mess continuing in Latin America. The world has changed too. The BRICS have come up. Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa. Well, does Cuba have any friends there? Heck yes. Brazil, Russia, which considers it a strategic relationship, China, which considers it a strategic relationship, India, which is getting very friendly with it, and South Africa, which is, of course, is a very good friend of Cuba. So the U.S. government had to see also the future of the world, of these newly rising countries, is favoring Cuba. You know, we still have the power. We can still control the world economies and all that because we can print the dollars and you can't. But that was not, this did not augur well for pretending to be able to overthrow the Cuban government. Because China will give Cuba anything they need. They're not going to run out of consumer goods. And Venezuela, as long as it is not overthrown, is going to give Cuba whatever oil it needs until Cuba finds its own way, and so on. So this is all what lies behind this change of mind by the more enlightened circle of people inside the U.S. government. It doesn't mean that we're friends now, the U.S. and Cuba. It doesn't mean that we're buddies. It doesn't mean that we truly respect the independence of each other. No, the U.S. is still the big guy and Cuba is still the little guy. There's a tremendous asymmetry. And there's a lot to discuss then in order to resolve what is blocking the road to full relationship, no, not to full relations, to normalized relations. There are now relations, there are new ambassadors or ambassadors to be. One is official, another one is to be named. there is a whole different atmosphere. It's more easy. It's easier to travel to Cuba now and so on. The atmospherics are good, but once you get into, well, what about the Helms-Burton law? It says we can't recognize you until you've done this and this and this and this and this and this, and that's a really hard list of requirements. And when they said, somebody says, so there'll be lawyers getting into the deal too, not from one side or another, just from the money side. Well, I claim X million dollars that they owe me because my property was nationalized. Those claims are now, I think, around $6 billion, and they're supported by the U.S. government. The Cubans are saying, fine, we have added up the damages you cost us with your blockade, so you owe us close to maybe $300 billion. So let's just trade that off. Here's $6 billion. And a lot of people here would say, no, that's not how it works. And the U.S. will say, okay, you need to open up your economy. We want our folks to get in there. And Cuba will say, some, we'll consider those who are helpful, we'll do joint ventures and so on. But we're not going to be Costa Rica, we're not going to be Honduras. Okay? We are our own country. And people in the country will say, I can't. We can't go along with such a thing. There's a lot still to be resolved before U.S.-Cuba relations can be considered in any way normal. And my view is that, given all that background sketched out, and the importance, the history of it, and the way that generations of apparatchiks in the State Department and in the CIA and the Pentagon and all that, generations of them have dedicated themselves to overthrowing Cuba, to being able to say, I did it, I was on the watch the day that we overthrew the Cuban Revolution. There's a lot of people who are against this. The people who make a living from it, because counter-revolution is a major industry in Miami and other places, including on the island, like the ladies in white collecting a check every weekend. All of that noise is in the background too. And next year, we don't know who's going to be president. We don't know what the Congress is going to be saying. The Congress has to undo the Helms-Burton regulation. And you need a majority of the Congress, Senate and the House, to do that. It may just be enough opposition to not allow the lifting of the blockade. So we don't know. It's hard to say where it's going. In general, here I'm getting to the end of this. My view is that what has happened between the current government and the government of Cuba is very good. It lifts the spirits, it creates spaces, it has led already to a number of European and other countries, mostly European, Mexico too, to jump into the Cuban economy, because they're not prohibited by any legislation. They were afraid before to go beyond a certain range of actions. But now that the U.S. government is saying we want to undo the U.S. legislation, countries like France and Britain, and Germany, and Mexico are saying, here's our chance.